You want to say something? I'm just get a quick level here.
Oh, okay.
That's good. That's good.
Okay.
Cooperative Legacy Project interview number 21, October 20th, 2005. We're visiting with Don Paulsen, former general manager of Golden West Telephone Cooperative and a member of the South Dakota Co-op Hall of Fame. Don, where were you born?
I was born in New Underwood, South Dakota in 1930.
1930.
And the first baby in the new hospital that they'd had then were Dr. O'Toole.
Where was your family originally from?
Actually, we lived near New Underwood on a farm and ranch. Grew up on that. Went to the New Underwood High School 4 years, and after that, one of my favorite subjects in high school, besides athletics, was bookkeeping and accounting, as we call it now. And so I decided to go to business college. I was a little short of money, and I went to the National School of Business in Rapid City. And that was interrupted by a blizzard in December and January of 1949, and at which time my parents were moving to a large ranch just north of Quinn, South Dakota. And of course, and I was down there, and I broke it up. At that time, I was a little short of money, and I thought, well, there's an opening looking for a bookkeeper at the local REA, which is a West River Electric Association of Wall. And I went over and applied for the job, and they hired me. So thereafter, I had worked for them up until January of 1951, and the Korean War had started. And of course, some of the friends I had that worked on the outside crew were being drafted and going into service. So one day in Rapid City, I thought, well, I'm going to walk into the draft board and see what my call date's going to be. And the lady who was running the office says, well, I can tell you. And she looked it up and she said, you will be leaving in March. And I said, well, you can put me on the list right now, and then I'll know when I'm going in. So actually then I went into service ahead of the draft call. They sent me to Fort Lewis, Washington. I processed there, and then I went on down to Fort Ord, California, and took my basic training. And I was put in a 6-week basic training course, and thereafter was sent to Fort Benjamin Harris, Indianapolis, Indiana, and to Army Finance School. And I spent 4 months there, at which time then they assigned us to new post in the Far East Command. And I ended up in the Finance Center, the Chief Finance Center in Yokohama, Japan. And we were billeted in a small compound in the center of the Yokohama, and we walked about 5 to 6 blocks to a courthouse-style building that the Japanese had used for a shipping office. We were down near the docks where the ships came in, and I was then assigned there into the commercial contracting section. And what we were handling is the partial payments of contracts that the U.S. Army negotiated with the Japanese industry. And we would take the contracts, they would put them out for the partial payments. There was 8 of us, and then we would audit all the partial payments for compliance to that contract. And I stayed in Japan then for about another year and a half to complete my 2-year service requirement, and then came back to the States and went back to work for West River Electric again. And thankfully they hired me. that was, and it was very interesting. I really enjoyed my service and what we were doing over there because it was educational. We knew what was happening in Korea, and some of the contracts we had were for even cremation of soldiers coming back. But most generally, it may be for bearings for 6x6 trucks and everything else that the Army would need to support them in the activities in the war in Korea. But after coming back to West River, I was an accountant for those, and I worked in that position until about 3 years thereafter, and was made office manager and of it, and worked for the manager there that was OS Sid Soma, and that went on for until about 1950, and of course when they amended the Rural Electrification Act, which allowed the loans to be made for rural telephone cooperatives, a group of
What year was that, by the way?
the year that they amended the REA Act in October of 1949, which allowed the loans to be made to telephone cooperatives. And of course, the original name of Golden West Telephone Company was spawned in 1916 is a farmer-owned telephone company, and the person that was one of the persons that was really involved in that was a George Fauske, and another group from Interior. The Interior and Quinn at that time in 1960 were the main towns in that eastern Pennington County and Hockin County area. However, they fell in hard times with ice storms and everything, and the lines went down and nothing was done, and nobody wanted to participate in rebuilding them. But then when the REA Act was amended to allow financing for telephone, the son of George was killed in an accident while maintaining some of the old lines in those days back there, and in a car accident. But his son, Engelbert Fauske, energized a group of people and to get together and to form a cooperative, and there again they named it after the old company, the Golden West Telephone Cooperative, and they incorporated that charter on November 14th, 1952 then. That started it. So consequently, looking at the feasibility, and Engelbert Fauske made many trips to Washington, D.C., and to get it started. And of course, feasibility in the West River area was hard to justify in a lot of cases on a standalone operation. So REA and Washington representatives suggested to Engelbert that perhaps you could work a joint management agreement with West River Electric Association that had started and was quite successful at that point in time. That was worked out between the two board of directors. And the manager of the Rural Electric, OS Soma, Sid Soma, became the manager, and I became the office manager. Part-time is what we worked at. And of course, the first exchanges then that was built, and the REA loan was granted to the telephone in 1950. At that point, why we acquired the rights and service area to serve towns, for instance, like Wall and Quinn, Interior, New Underwood, and others. And at that point, then they hired 2 maintenance personnel and sent them to switch school, and they was a full-time employees, Sid and I remained the manager and office manager then up until the divestiture, which came in 1964. And then at that point, the Board of the Electric Cooperative said that perhaps the Golden West had achieved a level of operations that they could perform on their own. And at that time, they decided to hire a manager. And I felt that I would apply for that job. Mr. Soma had looked at going to Capital Electric at Bismarck, North Dakota, which was a excellent move for him. And so I decided to go with Golden West, and I was hired then in June of 1964 as manager of Golden West.
At that time, how many members did the Cooperative have?
The membership at that time was 5 exchanges, and is about 964 members at that time. It was rather small, but we did operate out of the office of West River for a short period of time thereafter, then moved across on Main Street into a rented facility, which used to be the Underwood State Bank building. We had about 14 employees, and then thereafter we started to expand. We went into the Meade County area, Inning, and up in that areas of Marine, and worked out arrangements with the City of Faith even to serve areas that we could not serve out of the Marine Exchange. Inning had an exchange, and we went into the Long Valley, north of Martin, and those areas on the reservation, Kyle. We served everybody, which is under the plan of the Rural Telephone Program. And then in 1961, the Titan site, Titan sites that surrounded Ellsworth Air Force Base came in. There was one in Hermosa, there was one at Sturgis, and there was one near Wicksville.
That was a little bit ahead of the Minuteman missiles.
Yes, that's right. And these complexes were a city under the ground, actually. They had 3 missiles in there. They had full facilities manned 24 hours a day. They had to be raised on platforms to fire. And we had 2 personnel that we used, and we had a full-blown switchboard in there connected to Ellsworth and connected through Northwestern Bell, who was serving the other 2 sites. And we was there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and providing communication support back to Ellsworth. The hardened system cable, of course, was manned by the Air Force. That eventually was phased out, that system, and then the next system that came in was the Minuteman I program. And on that particular thing, that project, we plowed underground cable to each of the launch control facilities, the LCFs, which each manned 10 missiles. And consequently, we had 5 of those installations, plowed 250 miles of buried cable. And the cable that we supplied was for support circuits back to Ellsworth. Actually, they had the hardened system that was provided and owned by the government.
Did they do the cables that went out from the centers to the various silos that were under their control?
Yes. Yeah, they provided that cable. That was a hardened cable and went back to the facilities. Yes, that is correct. And ours went to the capsule, and we provided 3 private line circuits to all of those. And that lasted for a number of years until that phased out. But in the meantime, then the Golden West continued to grow, and we looked at expansion to replace some of the revenues we lost from the missile defense system. So looking at the Bell system was being urged by the Commission, the Public Utility Commission, upgrade their rural facilities. Well, they were pressed, I understand, by financing to do those things. They had a demand in the more populated areas. So they looked at the rural areas, and many discussions I had with the Sioux Falls office and people, we finally worked out an agreement. And really what started us coming together was a small telephone exchange in Wood, South Dakota. And Bob and Mary Fronick, he was a farmer, rancher, and business person in Wood, was on the board of directors of this independent telephone company. And they had decided that maybe they should look at Golden West and see if we would come into that area. So they came in the office one day and we sat down and talked. And thereafter I went to the board of directors with the information that we gathered from them. And so the board says, why don't we make a area coverage survey and see what might be done. Well, then talking with the Bell representatives in Sioux Falls concerning this, because White River was in between our telephone plant and Wood, and it was White River was a Bell exchange, and so we sat down and they figured, well, perhaps we could work something out. Well, there was an agreement then that turned around, and we bought out a number of Bell exchanges. We went from like Martin, South Dakota, which was adjacent to our Long Valley Rural Exchange, and that which we were serving in the reservation. Then, of course, Phillip, we took them. Hayes was another rural exchange that was brought in, and Midland. And
what kind of service were those folks getting at that time?
Those folks...
were they beyond the old wooden crank phones? Or?
Oh, they were, yes. The switchboards actually that Bell had was what we call a 355 Western Electric step switch. It was an older switch, but it was a dial switch. However, we had party lines and everything, and our
rubbering by farm women.
That's right. And when we went back to our subsequent loans with REA at that time, and we had meetings in Minneapolis, I and the board president, which was Earl Waterliff in Marcus, South Dakota, we met with the section head, the North Central section head. There was about a 6-area state that we was tied to in Washington. And at that time, they were thinking, perhaps if you're plowing in cable, and the criteria before an open wire was always at least 5-party or more, and even 8-party rural and 1 and 2-party town. But okay, the new criteria they're looking at said if we're going to bury cable, that was the thing in the 60s, you're plowing in the cable, you might as well plow in. The cost and labor is such that you might as well add the additional pairs and the electronic equipment to apply to it to expand those service quantities. You might as well go and look at the 1 and 2-party system. And most of us sat back and said, how can we prove feasibility on this? And actually our thinking was more in the past. But anyhow, we came about right then to make a 1-party design. But Bell had a multi-party system in those things, and they give, fairly good service. They did a good job, but they had money requirements too. So we acquired the Wood Exchange, going back, was one that actually predicated the expansion. Then we went to all the other exchanges, and that gave Golden West a financial platform really to spring forward. Thereafter, I had a friend of the Jensen family in Hot Springs, and they've decided, and the older Jensen who owned the system over there, which is the Hot Springs Telephone and Telegraph Company in early days, had his son come back and operate the system. And young Les Jensen was operating it. We get together at meetings, South Dakota meetings. He was not a cooperative, but he was interested in expanding too, like into Edgemont and Oryx and Opal, and add those to the exchange they owned. And consequently, in North Dakota, Fargo meeting, I had him up there, and he met with one of the loans officials out of Washington, D.C. They then got a REA loan to and put dial service, improved service in those other exchanges. Eventually, Les Jensen decided that he would be interested in selling, and he was going to move to California. He was interested in teaching again, and he was a lawyer by education. And so consequently, we bought out the exchanges that the People's Telephone and Telegraph had and brought that into Golden West Empire, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So, but that continued on, and so Golden West did expand and move forward, and we were getting large enough then, and going to an all-buried system, and we eventually then improved the switches. We moved into solid-state switching that gave you all the other services. There was no party line service you had in the aerial plant, and the rates were very attractive. Settlements through AT&T, who shared how much of each call, were improved through the FCC and the urging of our National Telephone Co-op Association that I had served on some of the major committees there, and working with again with the Rural Electrification Telephone Division. We all came together, and I think then that AT&T and the Bell companies looked at it and said, I think it's probably a good idea that we participate in sharing and selling off this plant, because we're looking at the call volumes are increasing all the time. That will support the exchanges we sell, because we want to see those provide continued good service and maybe improved service. And that was a situation then. And I had an excellent relation with the Bell system and AT&T. And I think that's true of all the cooperatives that in the state association and other states. And we worked very closely with the National Telephone Cooperative Association, our national office in D.C., and the REA program. But that brought in an all one party, solid state switching, and just thinking back on a couple of cases in the aerial plant, we had ice storms. We had the roof go off of a central office, which put it out for several weeks, and you could go to bed at night and know when you had buried plant and everything was. And that we knew that's the time our customers needed that service. And not only for emergencies, but the service did contribute to the agriculture operations, being able to have a one-party service, private line. And it was one of the most gratifying things to me to come back and go to annual meetings that were well attended, and the members and see their enthusiasm for it, and the praise and the support we got. And I think that was probably a strong thing in my working career, and it was actually a career with World Electric and telephones, all 40 years almost I spent in it. So I work with a lot of good people. I miss them, and I've received many awards, not only in letters from the United States Department of Agriculture and our National Telephone Office, State Office, the South Dakota Association of Co-ops, and worked with the Farmers Union, Ben Radcliffe, at meetings when we were redesigning the telephone system and how it worked. So it was very good people all through my life, and I remember a lot of them, and we worked together, and we were successful.
Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to do at this point is I'm going to walk you back a little bit.
Okay.
To pick up a little bit of family history before, and then maybe we'll expand a little bit on some of the things you've been mentioning. Your family originally settled out here when in western South Dakota?
My grandfather came from Germany. And he was 4 years old. And of course, they came on the sail ship, and it was in 1874. He was just 4 years old at that time. And his folks came to eastern Nebraska, Pender, Nebraska, in that area. They was involved in agriculture and worked there. And he was there for a number of years, and as a young person then, in the early 1900s, about 1906, he decided that, and some of his neighbors there, that there's a lot of land in South Dakota, and it's almost for the taking, and we can go up there and homestead. So I think perhaps his wife and everything had some doubt about that at that time, but they got all their animals and everything. I think they had railroad cars that brought them into this country, and he homesteaded by going into what we call the lakeside country, north of Wicksville, small town that was about 12 miles west of Wasta. And the lakeside was about 14 miles north of the Wicksville, and he homesteaded in there. There was a number of people came in from that country down there. The Barbers, several of that family came up there, and Brassfields. They all got together, and my granddad built a large hip roof barn. And that was back in about 1918, 1920. And one of the things they did was hold dances there. In the upper and that lower Haymount door, he built actually a walkway up there that I was a small kid when I was very scared to death of that thing because it looked like it was up quite high. But they would move piano up there, and one of my sisters played, and then they had other people come, and they had orchestra there, and they danced. And he held those dances.
A regular barn dance.
Barn dance, and he was off from the gravel road, the main road going north and south. They was about a quarter mile to the west of that, where his place was. And in the early days, when my father would tell about it, he said all the people coming, it was in the days when we had Prohibition. And he said they would watch, and he said the guys that would bring their jug with them would stop back before they got to the place and count off, the fence post that they would set their jug by. and of course that was going on there, and those days. But that was really they had a great community, and there was people got together. And of course, they had the house dances, but when he had the barn dances, they all came there. So that was quite a thing that he did there. They in those days, thrashing. Of course, they had a community thrashing machine, and he ran the separator, as they called it, and that was his job. And of course, he had lost an eye when he was in Nebraska, and a bunch were dehorning, and they was holding this deer down, and he was, of course, at that day they just sawed off the horn, and the animal happened to get loose and jerked up, and it took out his left eye, and he always had an eye, but he only needed one eye. I found that out when he had disciplined me. But that's where the family started, and thereafter, of course, my dad was Ben, and he was in agriculture and farming too, and I worked on the farm, and even in those days, you went out and worked. I remember running the John Deere tractor on a binder. I'm 9 years old, setting out there day and out, and it was long days. You didn't complain. And of course, we didn't have the rural electric or telephone programs then, so you had to go down to the local dam. I used to go swimming at night. That's why. But anyhow, that's went ahead, and eventually, I was New Underwood in the school, and And then we moved to that large ranch north of Quinn, which is 4,400 acres. And at that,
quite a bit bigger than the original.
it was big. It was a big operation, and there was about 150 head of cattle and everything. I even thought I'd be a calf roper at times. And I can remember being out there, and we had the large corral and chutes and everything, and I took my watch off and laid it up on one of these large poles sported the chute. And then after a while, I couldn't figure out where that watch was. About 3 days later, I found it, and it all faded out. And so anyhow, there's a lot of things happened there. But it was, and finally, I decided that I would like to go back to work in accounting. I really loved that. So that's when I went back to West River Electric and appreciated the job that they offered me there. And from then on out, the story goes, I just succeeded and kept with it. Was in Army finance in school there, so turned out all well.
When you were going to school, was it country schools back in those days?
There was
when you started?
country schools when we lived north of Wicksville, which was we had moved. My folks had moved then. And we were about 4 miles north there, but the school was a rural school. They called it the Simon School. And the Simon family, Gus Simon, lived within, probably less than a quarter of a mile away. And this school served community. It had about 15, 16 kids going to that school. And we walked. It was a mile and a half across the pastures and everything to get there. And of course, I can remember in cold days, it was a difficult thing. We'd started out once, my older brother and I, we didn't get too far. It was so cold, and it bothered me. But I said, I'm turning around, I'm going back. So we did, but it was, and the teacher, one of my favorite teachers there, Nora Anderson, she was from New Underwood, and she later went into the Waves in World War II. But she was one of my favorites, excellent teacher. And so when we moved from that location, I think that was just in the 8th grade, and we moved towards New Underwood on the other ranch. Then, of course, went to a country school near that location, and then I went to New Underwood High School after that. I think the farm experience is an excellent experience. You learn that things didn't come easy. There were disappointments in it, whether in agriculture or rainfall and crops. And sometimes you grieve to see a beautiful field of wheat hailed out and see the look on your father's face, and say all this work and in just a few minutes it's gone. And that happened, of course, quite frequently in this agriculture areas. But it was, I think, it prepared you for life and disappointments, because there is disappointments in life, and that was at early age. It didn't seem right, but we enjoyed it. We had the good times too, and we rode horses to school and everything. It was great to be young at that time. Yeah.
Do you think out here early on that the initial settlers probably underestimated the amount of land that would be necessary to make it out here? That maybe the years were a little good to start with, and then when it turned drier as it normally does out here, that maybe that 160 or 320 acre farm wouldn't make it.
That's true, and like the 160 acre was the homestead size, and I think the Congress, the government, when they created the Homestead Act, was probably an error. But what happened there was nature took care of it, because one homesteader would pack up and leave, and you would acquire that homestead. So consequently, yes, it took a lot of acreage to, in fact, like I say, the farm and ranch we were on north of Quinn was like I mentioned, 4,400 acres, and And you needed an operation like that. That was a good-sized operation. Agriculture was about probably 300 and some acres compared to the ranching and the cattle end of it. That was successful, and a person could make a decent living there on that. But yes, I think there was miscalculations, many of them made in that respect.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems to me like there's been less change in agriculture in the ranching country than there has further east in the more farming type areas.
I think so too. I think the necessity created a different type of an operation and how they operated. And of course, the equipment that's manufactured now made life easier on the ranch. And there's no doubt the rural electric and rural telephone system have contributed to that standard of living for the rural areas. And there's no doubt that the equipment and everything else. Yet, financially, it is a tough situation in agriculture. And I think now that with the advent of the computers and everything, allowing people to commute and to get information, quicker and with just maybe a touch of a button. And so consequently, it has changed. And I think that has helped keep the cost of food down. It's contributed to the economy of the whole country. Because agriculture is a principal area of support and this in this whole country. So consequently, rural life is I think easier, and although there's fewer operators, they're bigger, they're successful, and they're highly qualified operators now.
You mentioned, I think, a brother. How many brothers and sisters?
I had two brothers, and the older brother was a mechanic, and he was working.
What was his name?
Marvin. Yeah, he was my oldest brother. He was 2 years older than I was, and he worked as a mechanic for years, and that was his. He loved cars and the equipment. An excellent. Even when he was small, the neighbors would come and get him to do things. And I can remember the neighbor would come over and said, "We're going to thrash, and we have to have somebody who will set that tractor up there on the drive belt and can line it up." Well, he had a knack for doing that, and of course they'd always come and get him to do things like that. And then he went to trade school, and was a mechanic in that respect, and so a good mechanic. I always get him to come around and fix any trouble I had in the car. And eventually, he went to work for the state highway department in Wall, for quite a few years, and then he had some problems in health and everything, and he passed away. The younger brother, Delmer, is out on the last farm that the folks had, and is north of Quinn.
Okay.
And his wife is from Minnesota. She farmer. She's a school teacher, and he met her while he was working in Rapid City as a younger person. And of course, they got married and moved on to the farm. And when he's still there, he was fairly successful farming. He even got an award, I think. For the Farmer of the Year when he was a young person. He got into purebred cattle, and but eventually he needed to expand, but he decided probably at that time he wouldn't do that. But he's still on the farm. He's retired and lives there, and he had a family of 2 boys and a girl, and the oldest one is going to Black Hills State University again and getting another teaching degree. And the younger one went there. He is a teacher, and he asked me what I would do if I was, when he got out of high school. And I said, he said, I got to have some money to go to school. And he said, I want to go to Spearfish. And I said, well, Tom, what I would do, I think if it was me, I would join the National Guard. And that will help you, put you through school, and I would get a commission. I said, I always liked the service. So he went up there and joined the National Guard, and for a while he didn't know if he liked that or not. But he stuck it out. He graduated and became a first lieutenant. I pinned down his bars along with his sister up at Mount Rushmore when the group graduated and got their commissions. He went back to eastern South Dakota, and he's teaching. And then the Guard got called up and sent to Iraq. Mm-hmm. Well, probably his mother wasn't too happy with my suggestion that he joined the Guard, but he went over there and did quite well and served his first tour, and he is now back in South Dakota teaching, and he's now a first lieutenant, and I think he's been assigned in Huron to the Guard there in a new position now. And so consequently, he's good. And of course, the girl in the family, she married a young fellow that she met in school, and she had went to South Dakota University, and she has worked for a jewelry company and design up here in Rapid City now. So now she has a family, and then I think she's working out of her home as kind of in that part. So that's about the size of the family, and they all get along pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it turns there, we get together in snowmobile.
Okay.
And and of course I'm the only golfer in the family, but a lot of good friends out here where we live, and we have a good time. So, but it's been a good trip so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When did you meet your wife?
Well, wife.
Talk about her a little bit.
Yes, she's Joanne. Of course, is from Quinn, South Dakota. Her dad run the tri-state elevator there. She has there was a family of 9 children there, and her brother lives near her, George Tennyson, who was the U.S. Marshal for a number of years and lived in Sioux Falls, and is retired out here. And the older brother, Jack, lives out here. He worked for a company in Wasta, a sand and gravel company, and Lyle, the other, he worked for the sand and gravel in Hot Springs. They did this. And Gail, who is one of us passed away, he worked in Quinn. He had the local bar in Quinn and a business there, so that. But and the daughter, or other sisters, most of them are in Arizona now, and they live there. So and one is in Minnesota, Ivanhoe, Minnesota. One of the girls married to a distant relative of mine, and my mother's name was Koopman, and she was from Pender, Nebraska, also her family, and one of her cousins had moved over into Minnesota, eastern Minnesota, and of course their son Elmer was in the United States Air Force, and he got signed to Ellsworth. And my mother talking to the relation, his father and mother, near Ivanhoe, and they had a farm there. And so anyhow, they said, well, you have a son that lives out there in Walls, South Dakota. Well, Elmer came down, and of course we was going to the country dances and everything, and Joanne and I, and so Twyla was one of the younger sisters of Joanne. And so Elmer's in, and he said, "Will you go on the dance?" "No, I don't think so." I said, "Well, I know a kind of a young gal that you might, want to go to the dance with." "Oh." So we did, and of course that's how they met. Went out north of Wall to Creighton, where they had dances out there periodically, and we went to the dance. And I guess from then on out, it just kind of developed, and they married. But that that's about the size of that.
Okay. You have any kids?
I have 2 girls.
Two girls.
Yeah.
Where are they at?
The oldest girl is in Rame, North Dakota. Her husband works for Farmers Union up there, and they have 2 children, Jess and Allison. And Jess does work for the Consolidated Telephone Co-op, and Allison is just going to college. She was going to Dickinson State. And the youngest one lives at Rockerville, which is just up the road here. Her husband is a School of Mines graduate. He's a civil engineer, and they have a home over here just 15 miles from Mount Rushmore at Rockerville, and he is a consultant engineer in Rapid City. They have 2 children, Jacob and Sarah. Jacob is a senior in high school, and he's our mathematician. He is he is already taking courses at School of Mines. He has enough credits to graduate here at the semester, and so he's our pride and joy there. And of course, Sarah is in the 8th grade in Dakota Middle School here, and of course she's active in band and all the other things the kids and things that young girls do, I guess. So that's about the size of the family.
Okay. Just got a few questions left. Looking at the situation that exists today, the kind of challenges I suppose that face organizations, face cooperatives have changed over the years. What seems like the biggest change to you, and the kind of challenges that are facing perhaps the cooperative system today as opposed to back in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think probably, first of all, there's been consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
And they always say, the old saying was, bigger is not better. But there is a size that I think that we practiced, and this goes back to our expansion, that bigger was better because we needed the resources and the qualified personnel to operate the high-tech equipment we've got. That's essential. To get too large may be a problem, as it is in certain areas, but it has been successful for at least the Golden West group. I think you can reach a point where you do not have the communication with all the outlying installations that you might have. However, with the modern equipment and the high-tech equipment we have now, it's just a matter of working with that outlying station using a computer or what. That could be a problem if you get too large. And I think some cases the Bell system found that out because they did not improve the rural systems, or they would be here to this day. But those are the problems that come forth. Technology, education, and the groups. I think in the communication business, we've taken great efforts. In the early days, the REA field engineer, loans person,
Mm-hmm.
and the accountants were the 3 people that visited your project. Those people come around and assisted. And of course, what we did then was develop the state associations, where we got together, the tech people, the administrative people,
Mm-hmm.
and the board of directors would meet. And at their quarterly meetings, and then even the annual meetings. Washington, the Rural Electrification Telephone Division, sent their people out, and we went to seminars, maybe in Minneapolis or so, for all new equipment coming out. Our consultants, picking good consultants, was an essential thing to the success. The engineering departments, the engineers that came as consultants were well versed in the technology and kept up with it. Our relations with the suppliers, we kept a constant relation. We sent people to their schools and so forth and it took money, but it was money well spent. So consequently, we tried to stay on top of it because there was such a involvement and evolution of the communication system, step-by-step switches that were electrical, mechanical, and to get rid of them in the 50s and then move up to switchboards that had identifiers and so forth. We modified the step-by-step switches to put identification on it, line identification, and all the other things. But yet it wasn't the high speed and the equipment we needed. Later on, we skipped over some of the electronic switches and waited for the step of the solid state switch. And we did that. We went with Northern Telecom. We made trips to Florida to look at Stromberg Carlson. We went to other states and looked at Northern Telecom in Illinois and other areas that supplied these switches. And then the seminars in Denver, Phoenix, so forth, until we were certain we got it. And of course, we had good direction from REA engineer. And they had an approved list, a telephone engineering construction manual, which was quite thick. And there was approved materials, even line materials, in the old days, poles, wire, connectors, all these type of things. And so they did research that protected the borrowers and protect the feasibility and the security of the loans. So it was a grand get-together of all organizations. And I say the U.S. government was a backbone, and it was the program that was one of the most successful. The REA Electric and Telephone Program is a magnificent and successful program. But we stayed with it and kept current technology. That took care of our subscribers, made them happy. One-party lines, identification for direct calls and all that. And one of the things that financially that I haven't covered is the participation and relationship I had with Northwestern Bell and then U.S. West. Was, for instance, when they put the 6 gigahertz microwave across from Rapid City to Sioux Falls, the relationships I had with them, we participated in ownership of some of those in our area. Now they did the maintenance because of the necessity of continuity through the whole system. But the investment, and it was we had participation in that so that we earned on with their combination of that investment. And consequently, my relations with Northwestern Bell, U.S. West are excellent. We had differences. In the early days, their long-distance toll carriers were put in our central offices because they felt at that time we was not qualified. And gradually, as we said, we built up the expertise over the years, owned all of the equipment in our service areas. The interconnection with the Bell system was excellent. We expanded into the auxiliary service such as cable TV and actually all the other services that the customer was made use of, and it's just worked out. And I think that the rural areas we brought up the standard of living, along with perhaps all the other accomplishments that agriculture has achieved in farm equipment and so forth. But with all the complications of repairing, a $30,000 and $40,000 tractor, you need a communication systems to talk to people, and we had it. And of course, it was worldwide connections. And probably just about the most pleasant feeling I ever had. If I sat down and think about it, you said, well, maybe I could have did this or got into that line of work, but it's been real satisfying. And you can sit down and maybe just feel good about it. If somebody had to make a call, it was 50 miles out in Meade County, to get a hold of a doctor or something like that. And it's just, and the annual meetings. I loved the annual meetings. We got together every year, and the members came, and of course we had, the free food and everything, and eventually the capital credit checks, which you didn't see for a good many years, But now they walk away with a check and a free meal, and maybe they had to listen to a manager's report or the president's report, but the entertainment with it, the rural electrics and rural telephones are integral part of agriculture in these rural areas. They certainly are.
Mm-hmm. Looking at some of the new technology, for example, cellular phone service, has that had any impact on Golden West, for example?
It did. When they divided up the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, looked at cellular, and I had spent at the FCC a number of times with one of our representatives, our national office. That was in the cable TV business, and then in fact, had an opportunity to go with some of the FCC commissioners to lunch, arranged by our national office, and meet them, work with them. But when cellular come along, they divided up the service areas, and consequently, they did it through all the states. In Golden West, we had several service areas wherever you had a telephone. For instance, in Hot Springs, we had a telephones in the eastern part of Wyoming. That gave us rights to be in a certain cell zone over there. And then we had those, of course, all across the western part of the state of South Dakota. Mm-hmm. And the board was a little bit cautious on getting into those service areas and doing anything. And eventually they decided that perhaps they might spin off some of those, and we did. And I had had several meetings in Denver with U.S. West, and then Cellular One was another organization out of Nebraska. And we had some phones out of the Ulrichs exchange that were come to Nebraska. So that gave us rights. And of course, the interstate highway going through Nebraska was really a prime facility to create cell traffic. Mm-hmm. And in Wyoming, but they sold those out for a premium amount. And even in Sheridan, Wyoming, we had interest. And then, of course, in western South Dakota. So actually, Golden West at that time, after I had left, I think the board, being involved in some of the acquisitions in eastern South Dakota, felt that maybe they would let somebody else pick up some of the cellular. So that's what happened there. But it's a great thing, and I believe nobody anticipated at that time that the volume of users that would occur in cellular telephone service. It was amazing. So, but they did sell those out for a premium and diverted that money back into some of the acquisitions and other activities that the co-op expanded into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's been also the advent of computer.
Yes.
And the internet in rural areas.
That's right. And that is another thing, the services here. And Golden West is a website, mm-hmm. and got into that, which was, I think, a very smart move. And of course, it was a natural move for them. And because that particular service it was a very, well, it's just added to the other services that we have supplied. It's a mobile type thing that people are all using cell phones now, and mm-hmm. That is a good service. And the computer is a really updated mode of communications that is, I think, a great benefit to agriculture, to business. It's immeasurable what it will do, and I guess probably for the recreational aspects of it too. Everybody's carrying a cell phone. Everybody's got a computer and access to all the information you would ever want.
Mm-hmm.
Or
and
maybe
a little misinformation too.
That's correct. The little you didn't want, but everybody sits on the computer, and old and young alike. And I think it's kind of amusing that some said, "Oh, I don't want to touch that thing because I did something in a leave, so I don't want to do it." But everybody's getting used to it. Even the libraries have it for the older senior citizens, and it's just like they say, it's just nationwide now. So it's a different world than we have been known.
Yep. You retired in 1991.
Yes.
What have you been doing since then? Obviously, you've been playing a little golf.
Well, we've when we came up, retired. We was living on Sheridan Lake Road. We had 4 acres and a long, beautiful home up there. But we had a lot of pine needles and everything to take care of. I enjoyed, taking care of that. We had quite a little work there, and of course, after a while, we decided that maybe there's too much here in retirement, we would move. Then we moved here, and of course, we played golf, and we belong to Canyon Lake Methodist Church. Go there and
just enjoy the beautiful scenery here.
And the scenery. I snowmobile. Joanne doesn't care too much for that, but I'm probably going to quit that. But we travel. Joanne's got 3 sisters down in Mesa, Arizona. We usually go down there in the spring for a month and a half or 2 months, and so visit people. And like I say, we snowmobile. Brother still does that. We usually go to Wyoming, Colorado, and those areas and so forth. But I used to hunt pheasants east, but I don't do that anymore. And but we enjoy it here. We're close to town, and Joanne has actually she got 3 brothers in town now, and so we go to Mount Rushmore for breakfast and all those things. And of course, we got the grandchildren. Have to go to the band concerts. And when I have a computer problem, I call on that grandson over at Rockerville, and he comes over and says, "Well, Grandpa, you did this wrong." But anyhow, it's enjoyable. We just do the easy life.
Yeah. What kind of advice would you give to someone today, if who was thinking about getting involved with in the communications area as you were with Golden West?
Well, I think, in fact, with just looking at Golden West, I know that in several cases, for instance, George Strandl, George is a current manager, general manager. Dwight Flatt is there with him in the management, and
is he related to Elmer?
Yes, Elmer is his uncle, and of course Elmer was working for West River Electric, and I was young guys then, and and then Merle Flatt is Dwight's dad, and he was plant superintendent for years at West River Electric. Well, and just like Dwight went to state college, and when he got out, he was looking. But during the summer vacations, one of the ladies in the office, her boy was going to Vermilion, to the university, and they would come in. When we went to Buried Plant, we had a lot of joint use line that had to be retired, and we had an older line person that did work at the Titan site in that. And Clarence Jarvis, and a great person. He was a retired farmer, but pretty smart, savvy guy. And we put him out retiring the open wire lines. And he had 3 young fellows. He had Dwight, and of course he had Gary Jensen, who was a son of one of our plant superintendent of Golden West. And of course Clark Mortensen, and Clark now he went to college at Black Hill State. Those 3 went out with Clarence, and of course they got a lot of work done. He taught them how to climb poles and watched them, burn the pole. But anyhow, The guys that work there, I think it's a great thing. And of course, Dwight turned around when he graduated and came back. And we hired him, and he worked in the CATV section, the cable TV, and a terrific employee. And Clark, same way, graduated from Black Hills State. He came back, and he went to Golden West, which was a show that they liked what their fathers did, and of course with one of the early employees was Harold Mortensen, Clark's dad. And he was a central office switch person back when we first started, and Stromberg step-by-step switches, and one of the best. And he died. We had a blizzard and Wall, and they had a fairly new home that he got. He was a service person too, and served in the Navy. And they had lost the power and everything, and they was running the oven, I guess, and the stove in the kitchen, and somehow it took the oxygen out. And Harold had a little bit of respiration problem, minor things, and he passed away on it. Very critical, and that was glad to see Clark come back and be a highly valuable employee too. And then of course those three boys, and Gary Jensen, Marlin's the superintendent's boy, he went to trade school and came out and actually ended up now in the state of Washington. He's a mechanic and that type of thing. So they all was good boys. They worked in the summer help, and everything that Golden West did there contributed, I think, to them becoming really successful people in their lives. And so that had to be a good feeling. And as far as the outside help that we had, that was about the size of it because of the nature of our construction and everything was done by contractors. Yeah. And of course, I can't say enough good about George Strandl and his dad, Byron Strandl, and a couple of the other Strandl boys that worked as consultants or actually project engineers. George walked a lot of miles of the cable and did a lot of work. Byron has started out School of Mines graduate, electrical engineer, and he worked on La Creek Electric at Martin Systems, Grand Electric, REA, and then eventually down eastern South Dakota and set up an office in Watertown. And he did telephone work for some of the telephone co-ops. And of course, we had our original engineer in Flahart and Dittman Engineering out of Rapid City. And they did most of the A section and then B section. And thereafter, one of those partners retired and they cut back on their work. And we got Byron, because Byron, actually, his family's from the Wall area. Mm-hmm. And his father was mayor of Wall for a number of years, Alfred. And Alfred was quite a guy. And he was mayor for years. And of course, he moved to Rapid City and had his engineering office and at Byron. And consequently, we employed them. We went to the Wall. He met me in the Wall Drug coffee shop, and where everybody met, and that's where it all started. And that goes right back to the earliest years of Golden West, as far as starting in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Good people.
Mm-hmm. I usually finish up with one last question, and I can almost anticipate your answer to this one, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
In this country, western South Dakota, I speak to, I think I'm quite optimistic about this area because of the fact that no matter where you live, with the communications that has developed, and I cite one situation that is in northern Meade County, and this person is using the communication supplied by Golden West to do all his business. And he's staying at home. Normally that person would have to be in Rapid City, Sioux Falls, Huron, or some other place. But I am really optimistic. First of all, communications, dependable communications, a final, the rural electrics in the outposts, and I think probably the economy that they've contributed to has helped to keep people in rural areas. And I think the quality of people operating ranches, the investments that they have, are certainly, I think they've got a good future. There is consolidation, but they've got the tools to work with, and that's communications, computers, a top-rated telephone system, and all the data what they need. This area here, we see people coming back in here from the West Coast and to get into probably a better environment for their families, to raise their families, education, quality education. I think we have top colleges in the state, Brookings, Vermilion, and Spearfish, and the School of Mines in Rapid City, as well as the other trade schools we have in Mitchell that have helped put a lot of people in some of the utility work and the mechanics and so forth. So it's great. And I really think that if you go back and look at the quality of the people, education-wise, knowledge-wise, it's been an enormous improvement because that was available to them and they made use of it. And I think the work ethic is still here, and we always brag about the work ethic in South Dakota and the rural areas. We still have it, and we're attracting people back here for a better, just a better retirement life, and many of them come back. And I think that's probably we're looking at a good future. There's going to be a tough road ahead for a lot of things. But for the West River area, the defense system, we believe that we worked hard to save Ellsworth. That contributes to the defense of our country and the world, for that matter. So, I think I'm very upscale of what I think about the thing.
Okay, we've been visiting with Don Paulsen. Thank you for participating in the Cooperative Legacy Project.
I appreciate the opportunity.